When people imagine medieval life, they often picture kings on thrones, knights in shining armor, and stone castles rising proudly above the countryside. Even when servants are mentioned, they are usually portrayed as quiet figures in clean tunics, efficiently pouring wine or carrying trays through torchlit halls. The reality was far less romantic. For medieval servants, daily life was dirty, exhausting, dangerous, and often brutally short. They lived at the bottom of a rigid social hierarchy, surrounded by filth, disease, and constant insecurity, serving masters whose comfort depended entirely on their suffering. Medieval servants were not a single group. They included kitchen boys, chambermaids, grooms, stable hands, porters, scullions, wet nurses, and personal attendants. Some worked in castles and noble households, others in monasteries, urban homes, inns, or farms. What united them was dependency. A servant owned little, earned little, and could be dismissed at any time. Wages were low, irregular, and often paid partly in food or cast-off clothing. Many servants were hired young and moved from household to household, never putting down roots, never escaping poverty. Cleanliness, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. Servants worked in environments thick with dirt and waste. In kitchens, floors were slick with animal fat, spilled ale, blood from slaughtered livestock, and rotting food scraps. Smoke from open hearths filled the air, stinging eyes and lungs. Chimneys were rare or poorly designed, so servants breathed soot every day. Pots were scrubbed with sand or ash, not soap. Water was hauled from wells or rivers already contaminated by human and animal waste. Hygiene was primitive, and servants paid the price. Laundry was another filthy ordeal. Servants washed clothes in cold rivers or wooden tubs, pounding fabric against stones to remove grime. In winter, hands cracked and bled from icy water. Clothing was rarely fully clean, merely less dirty than before. Bed linens, if they existed at all, were infested with lice, fleas, and bedbugs. Servants often slept on straw pallets that absorbed sweat, urine, and vermin. Straw was changed infrequently, meaning servants slept quite literally on decomposing bedding. One of the most degrading tasks fell to chamber servants, dealing with human waste. Medieval toilets were basic at best. Chamber pots were used everywhere, from peasant huts to royal chambers. Someone had to empty them. That someone was usually a servant. Buckets of urine and feces were carried through corridors and staircases, then dumped into pits, rivers, or open streets. Spills were common. The stench was constant. There was no protective clothing, no gloves, no understanding of sanitation. Disease spread easily, and servants were among the first to fall ill. Servants also faced exhausting physical labor. A day could begin before sunrise and end long after dark. Kitchen servants chopped wood, hauled water, turned spits for hours beside open fires, and carried heavy cauldrons of boiling stew. Stable hands shoveled manure, groomed horses, and slept near animals to be available at all times. Laundry maids lifted soaking wet fabrics that weighed far more than dry cloth. Chronic pain, joint damage, and untreated injuries were common. There was no sick leave. If a servant could not work, they were replaced. Food, ironically, was both abundant and poor. Servants often ate leftovers, stale bread, thin pottage, scraps of meat already gnawed by rats or dogs. Fresh fruit and vegetables were seasonal and limited. Malnutrition was widespread, weakening immune systems and shortening lives. In times of famine or war, servants were among the first to starve, dismissed from households that could no longer afford them. Violence was an ever-present threat. Masters were legally and socially empowered to discipline servants physically. Beatings were common and rarely questioned. A servant accused of theft, laziness, or disrespect could be whipped, dismissed without pay, or imprisoned. Servants had little legal protection and almost no recourse. Complaining could mean unemployment, and unemployment often meant vagrancy, which itself was criminalized. Disease haunted servant life. Crowded living quarters, poor nutrition, and constant exposure to waste made servants vulnerable to infections. Tuberculosis, dysentery, typhus, and skin diseases spread rapidly through servant populations. During plague outbreaks, servants were often forced to continue working in infected households, cleaning rooms, and handling corpses. Many died quietly, unrecorded, their absence barely noticed. Perhaps the cruelest truth is how invisible medieval servants were. Chronicles praised kings and battles, not the people who scrubbed floors, cooked meals, and kept households functioning. Servants left few written records because they could not read or write. Their lives are reconstructed only indirectly through account books, laws, and complaints from masters. History remembers the table, not the hands that set it. Yet without servants, medieval society would have collapsed. Castles would have rotted in filth. Cities would have drowned in waste, and noble life would have been impossible. Servants were the human infrastructure of the Middle Ages, absorbing dirt, exhaustion, and danger so others could live in relative comfort. The filthy truth about medieval servants is not just about mud, waste, and vermin. It is about a system that normalized suffering, where cleanliness was a privilege and dignity was scarce. Behind every grand hall and lavish feast stood countless exhausted people, living short, brutal lives in the shadows. Their story is uncomfortable, unpleasant, and essential, because it reminds us that the medieval world was built not only on stone and steel, but on dirt, sweat, and forgotten human bodies. Close your eyes now. Let the modern world dissolve into the shadows. Imagine the heavy, suffocating darkness of a great stone kitchen in the year 1350, where the air is thick with the scent of old wood smoke and cold grease. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. We begin not with the sunrise, but in the hour of the wolf, that profound silence just before the first grey light touches the horizon. You are waking up, but not in a bed. Your cheek is pressed against a rough canvas sack stuffed with straw, and beneath that, the hard, unforgiving flagstones of the kitchen floor. The cold here is not just a temperature. It is a physical weight seeping up from the earth, settling into your joints, making your fingers stiff and clumsy before the day has even begun. Around you, in the gloom, are the shapes of others, the scullions, the turnspits, perhaps a stable boy who crept in for warmth, all huddled together like a litter of puppies. It is a common myth that servants always had their own quarters. In reality, many lower-ranking servants slept exactly where they worked, curling up near the dying embers of the hearth to steal the last fading heat of yesterday's fire. You can hear their breathing, a rhythmic chorus of exhausted sighs, and the occasional soft whimper of a dreaming hound, for the dogs sleep here too. their warm bodies the only luxury available to the shivering kitchen staff. You sit up, rubbing the grit from your eyes, tasting the stale ash that hangs permanently in the air. It coats your tongue, your skin, the inside of your nose. The fire is dead, or nearly so. Last night, the curfew bell rang, a term derived from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, signaling the time to bank the flames for safety. Now, it is your task, in the freezing dark, to coax life back into the blackened logs. You crawl towards the hearth, the stone biting into your knees. This is the heart of the house, and if it does not beat, the castle does not wake. You find the tinderbox, your hands trembling slightly, not just from cold, but from a hunger that is always there, a dull ache in the center of your stomach. There is no romance in this moment, only the sharp smell of flint and steel, the frantic prayer for a spark, and the sudden, stinging cloud of smoke as the kindling catches, illuminating the vast cavernous room where the day's labor awaits you like a waiting beast, with the fire now catching, snapping hungrily at the dry wood and casting long, dancing shadows against the soot-stained walls. You might expect a moment of rest, a chance to warm your hands before the true labor begins. But the medieval kitchen is a beast that is always thirsty. You turn away from the growing warmth and push open the heavy oak door leading to the courtyard, and immediately the comfort of the hearth is stolen by the biting morning air. It is a damp cold, the kind that clings to your woolen tunic and finds the gaps in your boots. And here, in the grey pre-dawn light, you face the second great tyranny of the servant's life, the water. We often forget, in our age of turning taps and endless flow, that water is heavy, brutally, unforgivably heavy, and every drop needed for the castle's day must be carried by human hands. You pick up the yoke, a piece of ash wood worn smooth by the shoulders of those who came before you, polished by sweat and the oils of unwashed skin, until it feels almost like bone. It fits over your neck with a familiar dull pressure, and you hook 2 large buckets to the chains that dangle from either side. These are not light plastic bales. They are coppered oak bound with iron, weighing several pounds even when empty. And as you walk towards the well in the center of the courtyard, the silence of the castle is broken only by the crunch of your boots on the frost-hardened mud and the hollow clunk-clunk of the buckets against your legs. There is a specific rhythm to this work, a pendulum swing you must master to keep the water from sloshing out once the vessels are full. A dance of balance that requires a surprising amount of core strength. You reach the well, a stone circle that breathes out a scent of wet moss and deep earth. If you are lucky, the castle has a windlass, a crank to help pull up the bucket. If you are a servant in a poorer household, you are pulling the wet rope hand over hand, feeling the hemp bite into your palms, hauling up gallons of dark, shimmering liquid from the water table below. Historians and archaeologists still debate the intricacies of medieval water consumption, often correcting the popular myth that medieval people never drank water and survived solely on ale and wine. While it is true that weak ale was a standard source of hydration and calories, serving as a safer, processed alternative to questionable sources, people absolutely drank water, especially the poor, and especially those doing heavy labor. But they were not foolish. They knew the difference between sweet water from a deep, clear well or a fast-running spring, and the dangerous stagnant water of a marsh or a city ditch. You peer into the bucket you have just hauled up. The water is clear mostly, though a few specks of grit swirl at the bottom, and it smells faintly of minerals and cold stone. This water is not for you to drink, however. Not yet. This first haul is for the master's basin, for the washing of hands and faces in the solar, and perhaps for the kitchen cauldrons that will soon be boiling beef or salt pork. You hook the full buckets to your yoke, and the weight settles onto your trapezius muscles with a crushing familiarity. A gallon of water weighs over 8 pounds. You are carrying perhaps 5 gallons on each side. 80 pounds of shifting fluid weight pressing down on your spine as you trudge back across the uneven cobblestones. This is the weight of water that shaped the bodies of the working class. Skeletal remains from the period often show compression fractures and distinct wear patterns on the vertebrae of those who spent their lives as carriers. You navigate the slick stones carefully, for a slip here means a spilled load, a wasted trip, and likely a sharp cuff on the ear from the head cook. As you walk, the water sloshes rhythmically, wetting the hem of your tunic, which is already damp from yesterday's labor, and will likely remain damp until summer. There is a strange, quiet intimacy in this task. The world is not yet fully awake. You can hear the distant, muffled sound of the night watchman changing guard on the walls, the clatter of a cart on the road outside the gates, and the soft cooing of pigeons roosting in the eaves. For a moment, you are simply a moving part of the landscape, a carrier of life. In some larger castles, there were specialized servants called equerri or water-bearers, whose sole existence revolved around this endless loop of fill, carry, pour, repeat. It is estimated that a large noble household could consume hundreds of gallons a day for cooking, cleaning, and the washing of linens, meaning the path between the well and the kitchen was walked thousands of times, wearing a groove into the very stone. You reach the kitchen door, maneuvering the wide yoke sideways to fit through the frame, a maneuver you learned the hard way after getting stuck on your first day, a memory that still brings a phantom flush of embarrassment to your cheeks. Inside, the air has warmed slightly, the fire now roaring, but the atmosphere is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and rising dough. You move to the great iron cauldron hanging over the flames. It is black with soot, a gaping mouth waiting to be fed. You tilt the buckets, pouring the water in with a heavy splash that sends a plume of steam rising as the cold liquid hits the hot iron. The sound is satisfying, a chaotic rush that momentarily drowns out the crackle of the wood. But your relief is short-lived. The cauldron is barely a quarter full. The cook, a large man with a face ruddy from years of standing too close to the heat, barely glances at you, merely jerking his chin toward the door. Again, the gesture says, and so you turn, the empty buckets swinging light and hollow now, the yoke shifting on your sore shoulders. You go back out into the grey morning. If the well runs dry, or if the water is deemed too silty for the high table, you will have to go to the river. The river is worse. The banks are slippery with mud, and in the winter, the edges are rimmed with jagged ice that must be broken. River water is a gamble. Upstream, a tanner might be soaking hides in urine and lime, or a shepherd might be washing sheep. You learn to read the water, to look for the clear currents, to dip your bucket where the flow is fastest. It is a constant negotiation with nature, a physical conversation with the landscape. As you walk back for the second, third, fourth trip, your arms begin to tremble with a fatigue that feels deep in the marrow. This is the reality of medieval cleanliness. It was not that they didn't want to be clean. It was that cleanliness was incredibly expensive in terms of caloric energy. Every hot bath, every scrubbed floor, every washed shirt represented hours of backbreaking hauling. You are the engine of that hygiene. You are the plumbing. When the master later dips his hands into a warm basin scented with rose petals, he will not think of the ice on the riverbank or the ache in your spine. He will simply feel the water. But you know the truth. You know the weight of it. You pour the next load, and the next, until the cauldron is finally full, the water surface trembling slightly from the heat below. You unhook the yoke, setting it against the wall, and for a moment, you feel lighter than air, as if gravity has forgotten you. But there is no time to float. The cook is already pointing to the corner, to a pile of iron pots from last night's feast, encrusted with burnt sauce and blackened grease. They need to be cleaned. And since soap is a luxury reserved for the master's laundry and body, you will not be using suds. You look down at your hands, red and raw from the cold water, and prepare to plunge them into something much rougher. The water was just the beginning. Now comes the grit. The water you have just hauled is now heating over the fire, destined for cooking or the master's bath. But it is not for the likes of you to use on the dishes. The great iron pots and skillets from the previous night's feast sit in a sullen, greasy heap in the corner of the scullery, a small damp annex off the main kitchen. This is the domain of the scullion, the lowest of the low in the kitchen hierarchy. The term itself, scullion, has become synonymous with wretchedness, and standing here, looking at the blackened cookware, it is easy to see why. The pots are coated with the stubborn remnants of medieval cookery. Thick gelatinous sauces thickened with breadcrumbs, burned-on frumenti, a porridge of cracked wheat and milk, and the charred fat of roasted meats. There is no bottle of dish soap here, no soft sponge, no rubber gloves to protect your skin. Instead, you have the scouring tools of the time. A bucket of sharp river sand, a pile of wood ash from the hearth, and a bundle of stiff birch twigs or a rough woolen rag. This is cleaning by abrasion, a brutal physical removal of filth. You kneel on the cold flagstones, pulling the first heavy cauldron toward you. It smells of stale onions and oxidized metal. You grab a handful of sand, its grains coarse and biting, and mix it with a scoop of white ash. When ash mixes with the residual animal fats in the pot and a little water, it creates a crude, primitive soap, a chemical reaction known as saponification. But this is not the gentle, scented lather of modern times. It is a caustic, stinging sludge that eats at dirt and skin with equal enthusiasm. As you begin to scrub, driving the sand into the iron with the heel of your hand, you feel the grit working its way under your fingernails, lodging in the cracks of your knuckles. It stings. It always stings. The friction warms your skin, but it is an angry heat. You scour in circular motions, leaning your whole body weight into the task, because iron is porous and holds onto flavors and fats with a tenacity that seems almost spiteful. You are literally grinding the surface of the metal clean. The sound is a rhythmic, rasping shh, shh, a dry, harsh whisper that fills the small room. Historians of technology often point out that the brightness of a household's metalware was a status symbol. A knight's armor had to shine, and so did his lord's kitchen pots. A dull, rusty pot suggested a lazy household, a lack of discipline. Therefore, you are not just cleaning, you are polishing, you are maintaining the honor of the house with the skin of your palms. After 10 minutes on a single pot, your arm burns with lactic acid. You rinse it with a splash of cold water, carefully rationed, remember, for you hold it yourself, and inspect your work. If a single streak of grease remains, or a spot of rust, the head cook might cuff you, or worse, dock your food ration. Satisfied, you move to the next vessel. This one is a skillet used for frying fritters in lard. The grease has congealed into a white, waxy solid. You scrape it out with a wooden knife, saving the fat in a separate slush bucket. Nothing is wasted here. This rancid, dirty fat, known as kitchen stuff, will be sold to the chandler to make cheap tallow candles, the kind that smell of meat when they burn and smoke terribly. It is a small perk of the cook's position to sell this waste, a medieval side hustle that you, the scullion, facilitate but do not profit from. As you work, the ammonia tang of the ash begins to irritate your nose, and your hands turn a raw, angry red, the skin pruning and cracking from the wet and the alkali. There is no lotion to soothe them later, perhaps only a smear of mutton fat, if you can steal a dab when the cook isn't looking. This constant exposure to harsh alkalis and wetness caused a condition often called washerwoman's hands or dermatitis, leaving the skin vulnerable to infection. A small cut from a jagged rim or a splinter from a wooden ladle could easily turn septic. You have seen older servants with hands that are gnarled and scarred, their fingernails thick and yellowed, mapped with the history of 10,000 scrubbed pots. It is a sobering glimpse of your own future. Yet, there is a strange, meditative quality to the scouring. The repetition clears the mind. In the rhythm of the scrub, you can almost forget the hunger in your belly. You listen to the sounds of the kitchen waking up fully around you. The heavy thud of a cleaver hitting a chopping block, the sizzle of onions hitting hot fat, the shouting of orders. You are part of this machine, a vital cog, even if you are hidden in the corner. Sometimes, you find things in the pots, a burnt crust of bread, a bone with a scrap of meat still clinging to it. If the eyes of the supervisors are elsewhere, you might quickly scrape these morsels into your mouth. It is dangerous. Eating above your station or stealing food is a punishable offense. But the gnawing in your stomach makes you bold. The taste of charred, fatty meat mixed with a little ash is the most delicious thing you can imagine in that moment. It is fuel. It keeps you going. You finish the last pot, your hands trembling, the water in your rinsing bucket thick and grey with sludge. You dip the dirty water into the drain channel that runs along the wall, a simple stone gutter that eventually empties into the castle moat or a cesspit, adding to the fetid aroma that surrounds the stronghold. You wipe the pots dry with a cloth that is barely cleaner than the floor, stacking them ready for the day's cooking. Your hands are throbbing, the skin tight and shiny. You wipe them on your tunic, leaving streaky grey marks, but there is no time to nurse them. The day is moving forward. The sun is up now, casting beams of light through the high, narrow windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The fire in the great hearth is roaring, a towering inferno that requires constant attention. And near that fire, the next task awaits, a job that requires not the strength of the arm, but the endurance of the will. You look towards the spit. where a massive joint of beef is already being skewered. A small wooden stool sits beside the hearth, bathed in an intensity of heat that would make a blacksmith sweat. That is the seat of the turnspit. It is often a job for a boy, small and easily overlooked, or sometimes for a dog. Today, the wheel needs turning, and the meat must not burn. You leave the scullery, the taste of ash still in your mouth, and walk towards the wall of heat. The scouring is done. The roasting begins. You take your place on the three-legged stool tucked into the ingle nook, a small, recessed alcove built directly into the chimney breast. And the transition from the damp chill of the scullery to this new environment is violent and absolute. Here, the air does not just carry heat, it is composed of it, a shimmering, distorting wall of thermal energy radiating from a fire large enough to roast a whole ox. This is the domain of the turnspit, a role often filled by the smallest servants, typically young boys, or, in a fascinating twist of medieval ingenuity, by specially bred dogs. You are sitting so close to the flames that the hair on your forearms singes and curls, smelling faintly of sulfur, while your back, exposed to the drafty kitchen currents, remains stubbornly cold. It is a physical paradox, roasting on the front, freezing on the back, that defines your existence for the next 4 hours. Before you stretches the great iron spit, a spear of metal thick as a wrist, currently skewering a massive joint of beef that weighs perhaps 40 pounds. Your job is deceptively simple. Turn the handle. But as you grip the polished wood, wrapped in a damp rag to prevent it from blistering your palm, you realize the cruelty of the physics involved. The meat is not perfectly round. It is heavy on one side, lopsided and awkward. As you turn, gravity fights you, pulling the heavy side down quickly, forcing you to strain against the momentum to keep the rotation smooth. If you turn too fast, the meat will not cook through. If you turn too slow, the outside will char, while the inside remains raw. You're a human motor, a biological clockwork mechanism that must maintain a perfect, rhythmic cadence despite the screaming muscles in your shoulder. Beside you, in a wooden wheel mounted on the wall, resembling a giant hamster wheel, trots your partner in this fiery purgatory, the turnspit dog. This is not a myth, but a documented historical reality. The Canis vertigus, or dizzy dog, was a specific breed, long-bodied and short-legged, like a corgi or a dachshund, bred specifically to run inside a wheel that turned the spit via a system of pulleys and ropes. The dog runs with a stoic, panting determination, its claws clicking rhythmically against the wooden slats, eyes fixed on nothing, driven by the instinct to work and perhaps the promise of a bone later. There's a quiet, tragic camaraderie between you and the beast. You are both tethered to the fire, both essential yet invisible, both working for the sustenance of others. You might murmur a soft word to the animal, a good boy, lost in the roar of the flames, and he might flick an ear in acknowledgement, but he does not stop running. If he stops, the cook will throw a hot coal into the wheel to get him moving again, a brutal motivation that ensures the roast never pauses. Historians and zoologists note that the turnspit dog is now extinct, its lineage dissolved once mechanical jacks replaced animal power. But for centuries, these dogs were a fixture of English and European kitchens, working in shifts to avoid exhaustion. On Sundays, they were sometimes taken to church to serve as foot warmers for the family. A strange promotion from kitchen equipment to lapdog, though stories persist of them running for the door the moment the priest began the sermon, conditioned by the sound of bells or chanting to think their shift was over. The sensory experience of the turnspit is dominated by the smell of roasting meat, which changes from a delicious aroma to a torturous assault. At first, as the fat begins to render and the beef browns, the scent is intoxicating, triggering a desperate salivary response in your empty stomach. You can taste the savory air, but after hour 2, hour 3, the smell becomes heavy, greasy, and suffocating. You are breathing vaporized beef fat. It coats your throat, your lungs, your skin. You are being marinated in the very meal you are forbidden to eat. The lecherfruit or drip pan sits beneath the roast, catching the golden, bubbling juices, the dripping, which the cook occasionally scoops up with a long-handled ladle to baste the meat. The sizzling sound as the liquid hits the hot surface is loud, like a sudden rain shower. Sometimes, the cook yells at you to speed up or slow down, his face flushed and sweating. But mostly, you are ignored, a fixture of the hearth no more important than the andirons holding the logs. The boredom is as dangerous as the heat. Staring into the flames induces a kind of hypnosis, a trance state where the dancing orange and blue lights begin to form shapes, castles, dragons, faces of people you once knew. Your eyelids grow heavy, weighed down by the heat and the rhythmic creak-clack of the spit and the dog wheel. But you cannot sleep. To fall asleep is to let the meat burn, a crime punishable by a beating, or worse, to pitch forward into the fire itself. Scars from burns are common marks of the trade, a map of errors written on the skin. To stay awake, you might count the rotations, or recite the few prayers you know, or play quiet games with the dog, watching his shadow lengthen on the wall. There is a distinct thermal fatigue that sets in, a dehydration that makes your head throb. You learn to drink the small beer or watered wine, provided not for pleasure, but for survival, replacing the sweat that pours off you in rivulets. Yet, there is a strange philosophy to be found in the turning. You are the keeper of the transformation. You watch raw, bloody flesh turn into something golden, civilized, and nourishing. You are the alchemist of the kitchen, using fire and time to create the centerpiece of the noble table. Scholarly debate often centers on the caloric intake of medieval servants versus their energy expenditure. While it is true, you might snatch a piece of bread dipped in the dripping when the cook turns his back, a sob that tastes like heaven. You are likely burning thousands of calories just sitting here, your body regulating its temperature against the furnace. You are burning yourself. To cook the cow. As the roast nears completion, the cook tests it by piercing the meat with a sharp knife. Clear juices run out, hissing into the fire. Done, he grunts. The relief is instantaneous. The dog is let out of the wheel, panting heavily, collapsing onto the cool flagstones in the corner where a bowl of water awaits. You unhand the spit, your fingers cramping into a claw shape, your face flushed crimson. The meat is lifted onto a massive platter, garnished with herbs, and carried away in a procession toward the great hall. You are left with the fire, the empty spit, and the silence that rushes back in. But the castle is a living organism, and as the food moves toward the master, so must the narrative. The feast requires a stage, and that stage is the great hall, a place that looks magnificent from a distance, but hides its own filthy secrets beneath the feet of the dancers. You stand up, your knees stiff, and follow the path of the meat, not to eat, but to see where the luxury you created will be consumed. You leave the kitchen and head toward the main hall, where the air is cooler, but the smell is complicated. For there, beneath the tables and the booths of the knights, lies a layer of history that is rarely swept away. You leave the inferno of the kitchen, your skin still prickling from the heat, and step into the vast, echoing expanse of the great hall. Here, the atmosphere shifts dramatically. The air is cooler, taller, and filled with the murmuring of diners and the tuning of a lute. To the casual observer or the modern filmmaker, this room is a picture of stone-cold majesty, with high vaulted ceilings and tapestries fluttering against the walls to keep out the drafts. But you, the servant who knows the castle from the ground up, know that the true story of the great hall is written not on the walls, but on the floor. You look down and you do not see clean, polished flagstones reflecting the torchlight. Instead, you see a thick, uneven carpet of vegetation. These are the rushes, dried reeds, straw, or marsh grasses, strewn across the floor to provide insulation against the biting cold of the earth and to soften the sound of footsteps. In a wealthy household, the top layer might be scattered with strewing herbs, meadowsweet, lavender, hyssop, and woodruff, which, when crushed under the leather boots of a knight or the silk slippers of a lady, release a sweet, grassy perfume. It sounds almost romantic, a rustic potpourri brought indoors to freshen the air. But this fragrant green layer is merely a mask, a polite deception covering a much darker, dirtier reality. The filthy truth about the medieval floor is that it was essentially a compost heap in slow motion. Beneath the fresh, green sprinkling of herbs lies the marsh, a compacted, decomposing mat of older straw that may not have been fully changed for months, or in some extreme cases, years. This lower stratum is a graveyard of the household's daily life. As you walk across it to deliver a heavy jug of wine, your feet sink slightly into the springy, damp mass. And if you were to dig down, which you try not to do, you would find a gruesome archaeology. There are bones thrown from the table for the dogs, half gnawed and buried in the straw. There are crusts of bread soaked in spilled ale, congealed grease that dripped from the carving knife, and the inevitable bodily fluids of a crowded room. Saliva, vomit from an overindulgent guest, and the excrement of the many hounds that roam freely during the meal. It is a biological sponge, absorbing the waste of the feast. The famous Dutch humanist Desiderius Erasmus, writing in the 16th century, was horrified by English floors, describing them as retaining spittle, vomit, leakage of dogs and men, ale, scraps of fish, and other abominations not to be mentioned. He claimed that the bottom layer was sometimes left undisturbed for 20 years, harboring a stench that was harmful to health. While modern historians argue that Erasmus was likely exaggerating for comic or political effect, a 20-year-old floor would likely have spontaneously combusted or walked away on its own. The core of his complaint was true. The floor was a living ecosystem. For a servant, this rushes system creates a unique and unpleasant set of duties. You do not mop this floor, you manage it. When the smell becomes too overpowering, or when the top dressing becomes too slick with grease, it is the job of the lower servants to refresh the floor. This does not always mean a full clean-out. Often, it simply means raking away the visibly soiled top layer and scattering fresh straw and herbs over the corruption underneath. It is a cosmetic fix, burying the problem under a layer of sweet-smelling denial. You might find yourself kneeling with a rake, pulling up clumps of grey, slimy straw that smell of mold and old beer, trying not to breathe too deeply. The dampness of the floor is a constant battle. The stone underneath sweats, the roof leaks, and the rushes trap the moisture, creating a perfect breeding ground for vermin. As you stand by the wall, waiting for a signal to pour more wine, you can feel the life within the floor. Fleas are an absolute constant. They live in the hollow stalks of the straw, waiting for a warm ankle to pass by. In the hierarchy of medieval misery, the floor flea is a democratizer. It bites the king's ankle as happily as it bites the scullion's. You have likely learned the subtle art of scratching one leg with the other foot without bending down, a necessary skill for standing at attention. But it isn't just fleas. The rushes hide beetles, spiders, and occasionally mice that scurry between the boots of the diners, snatching fallen crumbs. If a lady screams during dinner, it is rarely because of a ghost, and usually because the floor has just moved against her hem. There is a dark humor in watching the nobility pretend that they are not dining atop a stable floor. You see a duke drop a piece of fine venison, look around quickly to see if anyone noticed, and then kick it under the table into the rushes, feeding the ecosystem. Out of sight, out of mind, he thinks, but you know you will be the one scraping that venison off your boot sold 3 days from now. The maintenance of this floor is heavy labor. When a full mucking out is finally ordered, usually in spring or before a very high-ranking visit, it takes a team of servants with pitchforks and shovels to clear the hall. The old rushes are heavy, wet, and compacted, weighing tons. They must be hauled out to the middens or burned in great bonfires that smoke with a thick, acrid stench. Then, the stone floor must be scrubbed with vinegar and sand to kill the lingering odors before the new green carpet is laid. But tonight, the floor is mature. The scent of lavender battles heroically against the scent of wet dog and stale wine. You watch the hem of a noblewoman's velvet gown dragging through the rushes as she walks to the high table. The fabric, likely worth more than your entire lifetime's wages, acts as a broom, sweeping up the dust, the flea eggs, and the grease. The bottom 3 inches of her dress are quietly absorbing the filth of the room. She glides elegantly, her head high, unaware or uncaring that her train is becoming a biohazard. This visual disconnect, the velvet touching the rot, is the perfect symbol of the servant's world. You support the velvet, but you live in the rot. There is also a medical dimension to your fear of the floor. Medieval people believed in the theory of miasma, that bad air caused disease. They were wrong about the mechanism, germs, but right about the danger. The vapor rising from a damp, dirty floor was considered poisonous. Sweet-smelling herbs like wormwood and tansy were scattered not just for perfume, but as a rudimentary fumigant, believed to repel insects and cleanse the air. When you scatter these herbs, you are performing a kind of magical sanitation, a desperate attempt to keep the sickness at bay with the smell of a summer meadow. As the night wears on and the fire dies down, the floor becomes colder and damper. Servants who do not have a bed elsewhere might have to sleep here, on this very floor, once the masters have retired. You would find a clean patch, a relative term, perhaps near the hearth, where the heat has dried the straw, and curl up in your cloak. You would sleep on the compost you tend, breathing in the dust of the rushes, listening to the scuttling of the creatures that share your bed. But before you can rest, there is the aftermath of the contact between the noble and the dirt. The gown that dragged through the rushes, the tunic stained with wine, the linen napkin used to wipe greasy fingers, all of these must be dealt with. The filth of the floor does not stay on the floor, it migrates to the fabric. And so, the burden shifts from the hall to the water's edge. You look at the lady's stained hem and know that tomorrow someone will pay the price for that elegance with bleeding hands. The feast ends, the lights dim, but for the laundress, the nightmare is just beginning. From the muffled, herb-scented shadows of the great hall, the narrative moves to the edges of the household, to a place where the air bites with a chemical sharpness that makes your eyes water. You follow the path of the soiled linens, the wine-stained tablecloths, the sweat-stiffened tunics, and the intimate smalls of the nobility, down to the laundry. In a large castle or abbey, this is a dedicated stone building, often situated near the river or a reliable well. In a smaller manner, it might just be a wooden shed filled with steam and shouting. Here, you meet the laundress. She is often depicted in folklore as a gossip or a flirt, a lavender who sings by the riverbank. The reality is that she is likely the strongest woman in the castle, possessing the upper body endurance of a rower and hands that have been transformed into calloused, heat-resistant leather. Laundry in the Middle Ages is not a chore. It is an industrial process, a dangerous alchemy of heat, caustic fluids, and brute force. The modern nose would wrinkle instantly at the smell here. It is not the scent of fresh ocean breeze detergent. It is a thick, choking fog of wood ash, boiling water, and the unmistakably sharp tang of ammonia. You watch as the laundress prepares for the bucking, the medieval term for the main wash. This is not a daily event because the labor is so intense. Laundry is often done in massive batches, sometimes weeks or even months apart for the heavy household items. The dirty linens have been piling up, fermenting in hampers, and now the reckoning has arrived. The centerpiece of the room is a massive wooden tub, the bucking tub, which stands as high as a waist. The laundress and her assistants, often younger girls with red, raw arms, layer the soiled sheets into the tub. Over the top, they place a bucking sheet, a coarse cloth that acts as a filter. On top of this sheet, they pile wood ash. This is the crucial ingredient. When boiling water is poured over the ash, it seeps through, dissolving the potassium carbonate to create lye, a caustic alkaline solution that eats grease and protein stains with terrifying efficiency. The laundress ladles the boiling liquid from a cauldron, pouring it over the ash again and again. It hisses as it hits the cloth. The brown alkaline liquor trickles down through the linens, attacking the dirt, and drains out a spigot at the bottom, only to be reheated and poured through again. This cycle can last for hours. The danger here is invisible, but acute. The lye solution is hot enough to scald and caustic enough to cause chemical burns. If a splatter hits the laundress's eye, it can blind her. If she leaves her hands in the liquid too long, the skin begins to dissolve, becoming slick and soapy, not from soap, but from the fat in her own skin turning into soap. This is why her hands are always red, always cracked. They are in a constant state of chemical irritation. Yet, she handles the steaming cloth with a nonchalance that is terrifying, wringing out scalding heavy sheets that would weigh 50 pounds when wet. The steam in the room is blinding, a sauna of live fumes that coats the lungs. Historians often debate the social status of the laundress. While they were servants, they were often paid significantly more than other female staff, sometimes earning as much as skilled male laborers. This was danger pay before the concept existed, an acknowledgement that the work was brutal, skilled, and absolutely necessary. A castle with a bad cook is unhappy. A castle with a bad laundress is infested with lice. But the lie is only half the battle. For the stubborn stains, and for bleaching the master's shirts to a blinding white, the laundress employs a secret weapon that polite history books often gloss over. Chamber lie. This is a polite term for fermented human urine. Urine is rich in urea, which breaks down into ammonia over time, a powerful cleaning agent and natural bleach. It was so valuable that it was collected from the castle's chamber pots and stored in vats to ripen. You watch as the laundress takes a fine linen chemise, stained yellow with sweat, and soaks it in a bucket of this pungent liquid. There is a profound, almost poetic irony here. The king's most pristine, snow-white shirt, the symbol of his purity and status, owes its brilliance to the waste of his own bladder. The servant transforms the filthiest substance into the cleanest one. It is a biological recycling loop that would impress a modern ecologist, even if the smell would make them gag. The laundress does not flinch at the stench. To her, it smells like cleanliness. It smells like job security. After the chemical soak comes the mechanical violence. The linens are hauled to the riverbank or a large wooden trough for rinsing and beating. This is where the sound of the laundry defines the landscape. Thwack, thwack, thwack. You see the laundress standing knee-deep in the freezing river, her skirts tucked up into her belt, wielding a heavy wooden beetle or bat. She lays the wet cloth on a flat stone or a wooden board and beats it with all her strength. This is not gentle agitation. She is literally pounding the dirt out of the fibers. The shock of the cold water against her legs contrasts with the sweat on her brow. In winter, this task is torture. The water freezes on the hem of her dress. Her fingers turn blue and numb, losing the dexterity needed to handle the wet fabric. Yet she cannot stop. The friction of the beating warms her upper body, but the river steals the heat from her core. It is a battle of thermodynamics. The washerwoman's hands are now subjected to the twin assaults of lye-burn and frostbite, creating deep, painful fissures that bleed into the river water. Scholars of medieval hygiene point out that while outer garments, woolen tunics, cloaks, were rarely washed, merely brushed and aired, the body linen, undergarments, was washed frequently. The medieval theory of hygiene was that the linen undergarment absorbed the body's impurities, acting as a second skin that soaked up toxins. Therefore, changing your shirt was considered more important than taking a bath. The laundress, then, is not just cleaning clothes. She is the physician of the wardrobe, removing the toxins from the skins of the household. She is purifying the noble body by proxy. As the sun begins to set, the riverbank is draped in lines of drying cloth, flapping like white flags of surrender in the breeze. The physical exertion of the day is staggering, lifting hundreds of pounds of wet fabric, swinging a beetle thousands of times, hauling buckets of lye. The laundress sits for a moment on an overturned bucket, her hands throbbing, her back stiff. She might share a coarse joke with the drying maid, a flash of humor in the exhaustion. The master wants his shirt to smell of lavender, she might say, wringing out a cloth. So we'll rinse it twice to hide the piss. It is a small rebellion, a way of reclaiming power over the intimate objects she tends. The sheets are white. They are stiff, clean, and smell faintly of the sun and the herbs in which they will be stored. The master will slide between them tonight and praise the freshness of the bed. He will never think of the ammonia vats, the burning ash, or the freezing river. He will not see the blood in the cracks of the laundress's knuckles. But as night falls and the castle locks its gates, there is one task that remains, one that even the laundress will not touch. It is the task that deals with the source of the chamber lie and the darker, heavier waste of the household. The laundry has dealt with the fluids. Now, someone must deal with the solids. You watch the last of the light fade from the drying sheets, and from the shadows of the castle wall, a solitary figure emerges. He moves quietly, for his work is done only when others are asleep, and his presence is a reminder of the ultimate, unavoidable truth of human existence. The nightman is coming. The sun has fully set now, and the castle gates are barred against the world. But within the stone walls, a different kind of gate must be opened, one that leads not to the forest or the road, but into the dark, suffocating bowels of the earth. While the laundress rests her chemical-burned hands and the scullions curl up by the cooling hearth, the castle's most essential, most avoided, and most paradoxically well-paid visitor arrives. He is the nightman, known in the medieval records as the gong farmer, the gong firmer, or ironically, the gold finder. He moves through the shadows with a heavy, purposeful gait, leading a horse pulling a sealed cart, his presence announced not by a trumpet, but by a smell so profound and ancient that it seems to silence the air around him. The gong, in his title, comes from the Old English gang, meaning a going or a passageway, a euphemism for the latrine. His duty is to descend where no one else will go, into the cesspits that sit silently beneath the privy chambers, collecting the unmentionable burden of the household. Most medieval toilets, or garderobes, were simple stone seats projecting from the castle walls or built into the thickness of the masonry, with a shaft dropping vertically down into a pit or the moat. In a castle like the Tower of London, or a great manor house, these pits were not self-cleaning. They were deep, stone-lined cisterns that slowly, inexorably filled. If they were not emptied, they would overflow, backing up into the castle with catastrophic consequences for smell and health. The nightman is the only thing standing between the nobility and a tide of their own making. He works at night by law. City ordinances in London and Paris strictly forbade the transport of human waste during daylight hours to spare the sensibilities of the citizens. Thus, he lives a nocturnal existence, a shadow cleaning the shadows. You watch him approach the base of the tower, where the access arch to the cesspit is located. He lights a lantern, the flame sputtering in the thick air. He does not wear a mask, for none exists that can filter this reality, though he might chew on a piece of clove or garlic to trick his own nose. He is not alone. He usually works with a partner or a bucket boy, for the work is too heavy and too dangerous for one man. They pry open the seal of the pit, often a heavy stone slab or a wooden door caulked with pitch to keep the vapors in. The release of the miasma is immediate and physical, a wave of methane, hydrogen sulfide, and ammonia that would knock a novice unconscious. This is a real danger. Historical coroners' rolls record the deaths of gong farmers who suffocated in the pits, overcome by the damp or toxic fumes before they could be pulled out. The nightman knows this. He lowers a candle into the black opening first. If the flame turns blue or flickers and dies, he knows the air is bad, and they must wait or fawn the opening before descending. It is a primitive gas detector, a life-saving ritual in the dark. Once the air is deemed survivable, the work begins. It is manual, intimate, and brutal. The nightman must often climb into the pit itself, standing waist-deep in the accumulation of months or years. There is no hose, no pump. There is only a shovel, a bucket, and a rope. You observe the visceral mechanics of the task. The man in the pit shovels the dense, semi-solid waste into the bucket, which is then hauled up by his partner above. The sound is a wet, heavy slop, repeated hundreds of times. Fill, haul, dump, return. The bucket is tipped into the night cart, a barrel-shaped wagon sealed with clay to prevent leaks as it rattles through the streets. There is a fascinating historical debate about the status of these men. While they were social pariahs, shunned by polite society, and often forced to live in designated areas outside the city walls, they were also among the highest paid laborers of the era. A gong farmer could earn in a night what a weaver might earn in a week. Their dirty money bought good food, warm clothes, and a strange kind of independence. They were immune to the whims of fashion or the economy. As long as people ate, the nightmen had work. Furthermore, the waste itself, night soil, had value. It was a potent fertilizer, rich in nitrogen. After the cart was full, the nightman would drive it out to the market gardens surrounding the city, selling the load to farmers who would plow it into the fields to feed the vegetables that would, in turn, be sold back to the castle, completing the great circle of medieval biology. In this way, the nightman was a vital ecological link, the recycler of the city's nutrients. But tonight, standing in the pit, there is no philosophical comfort, only the crushing reality of the filth. The texture of the waste is heavy, mixed with the straw and hay used for wiping, and occasionally lost objects. Archaeologists excavating medieval cesspits have found an astonishing array of items: coins, jewelry, dice, broken pottery, and even glass urinals. The nightman is the accidental curator of these lost treasures. If he finds a silver ring slipped from a noble finger, it is his silent bonus, a glittering reward hidden in the muck. One curious feature of the medieval toilet was the belief that the pungent fumes of the garderobe protected clothing from moths and fleas. This is why it was called a guard-robe, protect robe. Nobles would hang their woolen clothes in the privy chamber, believing the ammonia would kill the vermin. The nightman, breathing these fumes every night, is likely free of fleas, but at a terrible cost to his lungs. As the hours wear on, the cart fills. The physical strain is immense, lifting gallons of dense matter while balancing on a slippery, shifting floor of waste. His skin absorbs the smell. It settles into his pores, making him an outcast even when he is clean. He is untouchable in a Christian society, necessary but reviled. Yet, there is a quiet professionalism in his movements. He does not rush, for rushing leads to spills or falls, and a fall here could be fatal, not just from the drop, but from the infection that would inevitably follow any cut. He works with a stoic, rhythmic efficiency, clearing the blockage so the castle can wake up tomorrow and pretend that waste does not exist. He is the keeper of the collective denial. As the first hint of false dawn touches the sky, the pit is finally empty, scraped down to the stone. The nightman climbs out, his boots heavy, his body aching. They seal the pit again, locking the demon away for another few months. The cart is covered and secured. He leads the horse away, the wheels creaking softly on the cobblestones, heading towards the city gates, which open early for him, allowing him to vanish into the countryside before the town fully wakes. He leaves behind a castle that smells, for a brief moment, of nothing. He has reset the clock of hygiene. He washes his hands and face in a bucket of water he brought with him, but the phantom scent remains. He is tired, but his pocket is heavy with coin. He disappears into the mist, a silent guardian who saved the city from drowning in itself. The castle remains silent, its stone walls cool and indifferent. But not all the servants are asleep, and not all the work is cold. As the nightman's cart fades into the distance, your attention is drawn to a soft, golden light spilling from a low doorway across the courtyard. It is a place of warmth, of gentle sounds, and of a completely different kind of smell. The sweet, grassy scent of dried clover and living bodies. You move away from the cold stone of the tower and toward the wooden warmth of the stables, where the air is thick with life and the breathing is slow and deep. Here, the grooms and stable hands have found a sanctuary that the kitchen boys and scullions can only dream of. You slip through the heavy wooden door, latching it quickly behind you to keep the draft out, and instantly, the world changes. You have left the cold, stone indifference of the castle courtyard and entered the living, breathing cathedral of the stables. If the kitchen is the stomach of the castle, the stable is its legs, and here the atmosphere is defined not by fire or filth, but by a profound biological warmth. The air is thick, textured with floating golden dust, and smells intensely of dried clover, sweet oats, saddle soap, and the earthy, pungent, but not altogether unpleasant scent of horse manure. After the stinging chemical assault of the laundry and the suffocating miasma of the cesspit, this smell feels organic and grounding. It is the scent of grass, processed by life. You pause to let your eyes adjust to the gloom, lit only by a few lanterns hanging from high beams, casting long, shifting shadows that seem to breathe with the building. You are not alone here. Lining the walls in stalls of oak and iron are the most valuable living assets the Lord owns, his horses, and sleeping curled up in the straw beneath the mangers, or up in the haylofts above, are the grooms and stable boys who serve them. For a medieval servant, the stable is a paradox. It is a place of hard labor, yes, but it is also one of the most comfortable places to sleep in the entire estate, especially in winter. A large war horse, a destrier, is essentially a 1,500-pound radiator. A stable filled with 20 or 30 such animals generates a collective body heat that keeps the temperature significantly higher than in the drafty servants' hall or the stone corridors. You watch a young stable boy, perhaps 12 years old, asleep on a pile of fresh straw just a few feet from the hooves of a massive grey mare. He is wrapped in a rough woolen blanket, but he does not shiver. The rhythmic chewing of the horses, the soft huff-huff of their breathing, and the occasional stomp of a hoof create a white noise machine that is deeply hypnotic. It is a lullaby of safety. However, This proximity carries a deadly risk. A startled horse can kick out with bone-shattering force. Sleeping within range of those iron-shod hooves requires a deep, intuitive trust between the servant and the beast, a bond forged in hours of silent grooming. The hierarchy here is rigid. At the top is the marshal or the head groom, a man of significant status who answers only to the master of the horse. Below him are the yeomen of the stable, and at the bottom, the grooms of the stool, not to be confused with the royal toilet roll, and the stable boys. You watch a groom rise from the straw, rubbing sleep from his eyes. It is technically morning, though the sun has not yet risen. His first duty is not to himself, but to the animal. He approaches a high-stepping courser, a hunting horse, and begins the morning ritual. He speaks to it in a low, rumbling murmur, a language of soothing nonsense that calms the animal. Easy now, big lad, steady on. The horse flicks an ear back, acknowledging the voice. This relationship is crucial. To the lord, the horse is a tool of war or a symbol of status, a creature to be ridden and commanded. To the groom, the horse is a daily companion, a roommate, and a charge. The groom knows the animal's moods, its favorite scratching spots, and the specific way it favors its left foreleg when it rains. The physical labor of the stable is intense, but distinct from the kitchen. It begins with mucking out. The groom takes a shovel and a wheelbarrow and clears the soiled straw from the stall. Unlike the nightman's burden, this waste is relatively dry and fibrous, valuable for the castle gardens. Once the floor is clear, he lays down fresh bedding, clean golden wheat straw or dried bracken ferns. A deep bed is a sign of a wealthy household. It protects the horse's legs and keeps its coat clean. Then comes the grooming. This is not a quick brush. It is a vigorous massage. The groom uses a curry comb, often made of wood, horn, or iron, to work the dust and dandruff out of the horse's heavy winter coat. He leans his whole weight into it, moving in circular motions. The dust rises in clouds, coating the groom's hair and eyelashes, turning him gray. This friction warms the horse's muscles and stimulates blood flow. It is exhausting, repetitive upper body work. A medieval manual on horsemanship might recommend grooming a horse for an hour each day. If there are 10 horses and 2 grooms, the math of their exhaustion is simple. Historians often debate the relative value of a servant versus a war horse. The economic truth is stark. A fully trained destrier could cost as much as a small village, or the equivalent of a skilled laborer's wages for 20 years. If a stable boy were to fall ill and die, he could be replaced for free by the next desperate soul at the gate. If the war horse colicked and died, it was a financial catastrophe. This grim economic reality meant that the horses were often fed better, housed more warmly, and medically attended to more quickly than the humans who cared for them. The groom might be eating stale bread and pottage, while he pours high-quality oats and sweet hay into the manger for his charge. You see the boy checking the horse's water bucket. It must be fresh, clean, and not too cold, lest it shock the beast's stomach. He breaks the ice on the trough outside and carries the water in, shivering as he does so, prioritizing the animal's comfort over his own. Yet, despite this disparity, there is little resentment in the stable. There is instead a shared quietness. Animals do not judge. They do not scold. They do not care if your tunic is ragged or your accent is low-born. For many servants, the horses are the only creatures that offer unconditional acceptance. You watch the groom checking the horse's hooves, lifting the heavy leg and resting it on his thigh, picking out stones and mud with a hook. It is a position of vulnerability for both. The horse could crush him, but it stands on 3 legs, patient and yielding. This tactile connection, skin to coat, hand to hoof, grounds the servant in a way the scullery maid scrubbing a pot can never feel. There is a stable peace here, a respite from the chaotic politics of the great hall. The equipment in the stable also tells a story. On the walls hang saddles, bridles, bits, and stirrups. The leather must be oiled to prevent cracking, the iron polished to prevent rust. This is the tack cleaning, a job often done by the fire in the tack room on rainy days. The smell of neat's foot oil and beeswax is heavy here. The groom takes pride in this. A shining bit and a supple rein are the signs of his professionalism. If the lord rides out and his tack breaks, the groom will be whipped. So, he rubs the leather until his fingers ache, ensuring that the stitching is sound. He is the mechanic of the medieval tank. As the morning light finally begins to bleed through the high windows, filtering through the dust motes, the stable comes fully alive. The horses are restless, anticipating their morning exercise. The doors are thrown open, and the cold air rushes in, mixing with the warm, hay-scented draft. The grooms lead the horses out into the yard, their breath steaming in the chill air. The contrast is sharp. The warm cocoon of the night is broken. But the work is just beginning. The horses must be exercised, the stalls fully cleaned, the feed mixed. But leaving the earthy honesty of the stables, we must now ascend. We move from the care of animals to the care of humans, from the straw-covered floor to the rush mats of the upper chambers. We go where few male servants are ever permitted to go, into the private, intimate world of the lady of the manor. The stable boy knows the horse's body. The body servant knows the queen's. It is a different kind of labor, one that requires not strength, but silence, and a terrifying amount of intimacy. The air changes as we climb the spiral stairs. The smell of hay and manure fades, replaced by the scent of beeswax candles, expensive spices, and the heavy, musky perfume of a room that has been sealed against the night air. We are entering the solar, the private quarters, to witness the unraveling of a queen. You ascend the narrow, spiraling stone staircase, leaving the earthy warmth of the stables far below. The air changes as you climb. The drafty chill of the lower corridors is replaced by a rising heat, and the smell of manure and wood smoke gives way to something far more expensive: beeswax, dried lavender, and the faint, metallic tang of brass pins. You are entering the solar, the private sanctuary of the noble family, a room hung with thick tapestries to trap the warmth of the fireplace. Here, in the soft, golden light of the morning, we encounter a servant who lives in a paradox of high status and profound servitude. The lady-in-waiting or the body servant, unlike the scullion or the nightman, this servant is often of gentle birth herself, perhaps the daughter of a lesser knight, sent to court to learn manners and perhaps catch a husband. But do not let the silk of her own dress fool you. Her labor is as physical and as intimate as any in the castle. She is the architect of the queen's appearance, the keeper of her secrets, and the custodian of her hygiene. The day begins with the ritual of rising. The noblewoman does not simply get out of bed. She is excavated from it. The body servant must be awake first, warming the lady's linen chemise by the fire so that the noble skin does not suffer the shock of cold cloth. The medieval wardrobe was not a collection of garments you could slip into. It was a feat of structural engineering. The servant approaches the bed, pulling back the heavy velvet curtains that enclose the sleeper in a box of privacy. The air inside the curtains is stale, heavy with the breath of the night and the scent of unwashed bodies, for even queens did not bathe daily in the modern sense. The servant helps her mistress up, and the construction begins. First comes the chemise, the foundational layer of linen that we saw the laundress scrubbing so violently. It is the only thing that touches the skin, designed to absorb sweat and oil. Over this goes the kirtle, a fitted dress that acts as a corset, supporting the bust and shaping the torso. Here lies the first struggle. The kirtle is fastened by laces, either at the front, back, or sides. The servant must pull these laces tight, bracing her foot against the bed frame or the lady's chair if necessary, ensuring the fashionable silhouette of a flat chest and a high waist. The lady might complain, gasp, or snap at the servant for being too rough, but the servant knows that a loose bodice is a sign of slovenliness. There are no zippers, no elastic, no Velcro. Everything is tension and knots. Next comes the cotardie, or the surcoat, heavy woolen or velvet garments lined with fur. These are not washable. They are worn for months, spot cleaned with breadcrumbs or wine, but never fully submerged. This means the servant is dressing her mistress in a garment that carries the accumulated history of spilled dinners and muddy hems. But the true test of the servant's dexterity and patience is the pins. The medieval silhouette was often achieved not by sewing, but by pinning. Sleeves were often detachable, pinned onto the bodice each morning. Veils, wimples, and hoods were intricate sculptures of fabric held together by hundreds of straight brass pins. The body servant often keeps a stash of these pins in her own mouth, lips pursed, as she works rapidly to secure the veil. One slip, one prick of the noble scalp, and she could be struck or dismissed. It is a high-stakes performance of dexterity. The result is a woman who looks like a statue, composed and perfect, but who is effectively trapped inside her own clothes. She cannot raise her arms fully. She cannot dress or undress herself. She is a prisoner of her own status, and the servant holds the key. Then comes the hair. Medieval women did not wash their hair with water often, believing it caused headaches or chills. Instead, hygiene was mechanical. The servant spends up to an hour brushing the lady's hair, distributing the natural oils down the shaft, and using a fine-toothed comb made of boxwood or ivory. This combing had a dual purpose. It smoothed the hair, yes, but it was also a hunt. The filthy truth that Hollywood movies ignore is that lice were democratic. They did not care about blue blood. Head lice were a constant, itchy reality for everyone from the peasant to the princess. The servant's sharp eyes scan the scalp as she combs, cracking the knits between her fingernails or dropping them into a bowl of vinegar. It is a primate grooming ritual, a moment of enforced intimacy where the barrier between servant and mistress dissolves into the shared biological reality of being human. The servant sees the bald spots, the gray hairs, the rashes that the court will never see. She knows the queen's body better than the king does. This intimacy extends to the most private functions. When the lady needs to use the chamber pot, She cannot manage the layers of skirts, the underskirts, and the tight lacing alone. The servant must accompany her, lifting the heavy velvet, managing the logistics of the act. In the absence of modern toilet paper, the servant might offer a cloth, a sponge, or handfuls of wool. It is a moment of profound vulnerability for the mistress. But for the servant, it is just another task, performed with a blank face and a steady hand. There is no room for embarrassment. There is only duty. The groom of the stool was a real and highly coveted position for men serving the king. But for women, these duties were folded into the role of the chamberers. This proximity gave the servant immense, silent power. She knew if the queen was menstruating, and thus not pregnant, a matter of state importance. She knew if the queen was ill. She knew who the queen was crying over. Gossip was the currency of the court, and the body servant was the banker, yet she had to remain invisible. She was a piece of furniture that breathed. As the dressing is finished, the servant holds up a polished metal mirror. Glass mirrors were rare and expensive for the lady to inspect herself. The image in the mirror is a lie. It shows a serene, perfect creature, untouched by labor. It does not show the servant's aching fingers, the pinpricks in her mouth, or the hours of brushing. The servant stands behind the reflection, in the shadows, her own dress simpler, her own hair covered in a modest cap. She has transferred her energy, her labor, and her care into the image of the queen. But there is one duty that goes deeper than skin, a service that requires a biological sacrifice greater than any other. As the lady turns to leave the solar, ready to face the court, a cry rings out from a cradle in the corner. It is the heir, the newborn life upon which the entire dynasty rests. The queen does not move toward the child. She cannot. Her duty is to the court, to her husband, and to her own recovery. Furthermore, aristocratic fashion dictates that breastfeeding is for the poor. It is thought to ruin the figure and interfere with fertility. And so, the cry is answered not by the mother, but by another woman, a servant whose very blood and milk have been commodified. The door opens, and the wet nurse enters. She is often a village woman, chosen for her health and the age of her own milk, who has had to leave her own infant behind to nourish the prince. The narrative moves from the artificial shell of clothing to the raw, primal bond of milk. The heavy oak door of the solar closes, shutting away the scent of the queen's perfume and the rustle of her stiff silks, and you step into a room that feels like a separate kingdom entirely. This is the nursery, and the air here is thick, humid, and sweet, smelling intensely of warm milk, chamomile, and the damp, earthy scent of wool drying by the fire. The cry of the infant heir, a sound that could theoretically command armies one day, is currently just the hungry wail of a creature in need, and it is not the queen who answers it. The queen's duty is to the dynasty, to her husband, and to the swift recovery of her own fertility, which breastfeeding would suppress. Instead, the most important biological task in the kingdom falls to the woman sitting on a low stool near the hearth, the wet nurse. She is likely a commoner, perhaps the wife of a yeoman or a healthy peasant, chosen for the specific, commodified virtue of her body. As she unlaces her bodice, a far simpler garment than the queen's armored shell, to offer her breast to the future king, you are witnessing one of the most complex and emotionally fraught transactions of the medieval world. To the modern eye, This looks like a simple act of childcare. To the medieval mind, it was a medical and spiritual transfer. Physicians of the time, following the ancient teachings of Galen, believed that breast milk was actually white blood, menstrual blood that had been cooked and purified by the heat of the womb and moved to the breasts. Because of this, they believed that milk could transmit physical and character traits. A nurse with a bad temper, it was feared, would suckle a wrathful prince. A nurse who was a drunkard would create a dissolute king. Therefore, the selection of this woman was a rigorous, invasive ordeal. She was inspected like a prize heifer. Doctors checked the whiteness of her teeth, the firmness of her neck, the shape of her breasts, and the color of her milk, tested on a fingernail to see how it beaded. She had to be temperate of complexion, neither too angry nor too fearful. Now, as she nurses, she is the best-fed servant in the castle. She eats white bread, roasted meats, and drinks strong, high-calorie ale, all provided to ensure the richness of her product. She is living in a golden cage, her diet strictly monitored to prevent corrupting the milk with onions, garlic, or excessive spices. She is forbidden from having sexual relations with her husband, as it was believed that conception would spoil the milk, turning it sour or poisonous. But beneath the comfort and the calories lies a tragedy that history rarely records. For the wet nurse to have milk, she must have recently given birth herself. Where is her baby? This is the filthy truth of the nursery, a stain not of dirt, but of grief. Her own child has likely been weaned early and left in the care of relatives, or worse, sent to a dry nurse in the village who might feed it cow's milk or pap, bread soaked in water, a diet that was often a death sentence in an era before pasteurization. Statistics from later centuries suggest that the biological children of professional wet nurses died at horrific rates. She is selling the life force intended for her own child to sustain the child of a stranger. As she rocks the prince, humming a soft peasant tune, her breasts relieve their physical pressure, but her heart carries the phantom weight of the absent baby. The psychological toll of this, holding a baby that feels like hers, smells like hers, but belongs to the state, is a quiet daily devastation. She loves this royal infant, for the hormones of oxytocin and prolactin do not distinguish between highborn and lowborn, but it is a love complicated by loss. She is a mother in exile, right there in the chair. The infant she holds is also a prisoner of the age. You look closely at the bundle in her arms and see that the baby is not wearing a onesie or kicking its legs freely. It is swaddled, bound tightly in long strips of linen banding, wrapping the body until it resembles a stiff Egyptian mummy. Medieval wisdom held that a baby's limbs were soft and wax-like. Without tight binding, they might grow crooked, or the child might claw its own eyes out. The baby is immobilized, unable to crawl or explore, merely a passive recipient of care. The wet nurse must change these swaddling bands several times a day, a process that involves unwinding the long strips, cleaning the child with warm water or oil, and then expertly rewrapping them. If the child suffers from scald, diaper rash, she might use a powder of lead or rose oil, treatments that range from soothing to toxic. The relationship between the wet nurse and her charge creates a unique social bond, milk kinship. In the eyes of the church and society, children who drank from the same breast were considered siblings, forbidden from marrying each other later in life. This means the peasant woman's own child if he survives, is the spiritual brother of the king. It is a strange, invisible web connecting the hovel to the throne. You watch as the baby finishes feeding, his eyelids fluttering shut, drunk on the warm, rich milk. The nurse lifts him to her shoulder to burp him, a universal human gesture that spans all centuries. She wipes his mouth with a cloth that she will likely wash herself, for she is often territorial about the nursery, trusting no one else with the hygiene of the precious jewel. She is the gatekeeper. Even the queen must defer to her in matters of the nursery routine. As the baby sleeps, the room settles into a heavy silence. The fire crackles. The nurse checks the amulet hung over the cradle, perhaps a piece of red coral or a wolf's tooth, believed to ward off the evil eye or prevent the baby from being stolen by fairies and replaced with a changeling. This fear of the supernatural is real and potent. In a world where sudden infant death was common and unexplained, the devil was always at the door. The nurse is not just a food source. She is a spiritual bodyguard, watching the shadows for demons. She sits back, adjusting her bodice, her job done for the next few hours. She might take a sip of ale, staring into the flames, wondering about the weather outside, wondering if her husband is tending the harvest, wondering if her own baby is crying for her in a cold cottage miles away. The isolation of the nursery is profound. It is a closed loop of eating, sleeping, and cleaning. But the castle itself is not an island. It is a node in a vast, sprawling network of power. The king, somewhere in the great hall below, is making decisions that will affect the borders of the realm. But how does he know what is happening on those borders? How does the order to levy taxes reach the distant villages? How does the wet nurse know if her own child is still alive? The air in the nursery is still, but outside the wind is picking up. The castle relies on flow of water, flow of waste, flow of milk, but also the flow of information. The silence of the sleeping prince is contrasted by the frantic rhythm of the world outside the walls. To understand the nervous system of the Middle Ages, we must leave the warmth of the fire, leave the mother and child, and step out into the mud and the rain. We must find the man whose feet never stop, the human data packet moving through the wilderness. The nursery is safe, but the road is a different kind of beast. The heavy wooden gates of the castle groan open, not for a returning army, but for a single, solitary figure slipping out into the grey light of the dawn. We leave behind the warm, static air of the nursery and the regulated rhythms of the household to step into a world that is vast, wild, and profoundly indifferent to human comfort. This is the domain of the messenger, the footpost, the nuncius. In a world without fiber optics, satellites, or postal services, the entire nervous system of medieval society rests on the calloused soles of this man's feet. He is the human packet data of the Middle Ages, carrying the king's will, the merchant's contract, or the bishop's decree across a landscape that is actively trying to stop him. The romantic image of medieval travel involves knights on horseback, their cloaks billowing in the wind. But horses are expensive, fragile, and require immense amounts of fodder and rest. For urgent, reliable communication over difficult terrain, the rich often turn to the professional footrunner. You watch him adjust the leather strap of his scrip, the pouch containing the sealed letters, across his chest. He is dressed not in armor, but in light wool, his legs wrapped in strips of cloth to protect against briars and mud. He carries a long staff, not just for walking, but to fend off the feral dogs that roam the edges of every village. He starts to run, not a sprint, but a trot, a shuffling, ground-eating pace that he can maintain for 10, 12, perhaps 14 hours a day. His enemy is the road itself. The King's Highway is a legal concept, not a paved reality. Since the collapse of the Roman Empire, centuries earlier, the great stone roads have been cannibalized for building materials or swallowed by the earth. The medieval road is often little more than a muddy scar across the landscape, a right-of-way rather than a constructed surface. In winter, it is a quagmire of sucking clay that can pull a boot right off a foot. In summer, it is a rutted, dust-choked track baked hard as iron. The runner must read the ground like a book, hopping from stone to root to dry patch, his eyes constantly scanning for the safest footing. To travel in the Middle Ages is to be in a constant physical wrestling match with the geology of the land. There are no signposts. There are no maps folded in his pocket. Medieval maps, or mappa mundi, were philosophical and theological diagrams showing the Garden of Eden and Jerusalem, not practical guides for getting from York to London. The runner navigates by a mental map etched into his memory by years of repetition. He knows to turn left at the lightning-struck oak, to ford the stream where the water ripples white, indicating a shallow gravel bed, and to avoid the dark woods near the crossroads where outlaws are known to wait. If he gets lost, there is no one to ask but the silence of the forest or a suspicious shepherd who might set his dogs on a stranger. The psychological weight of this solitude is immense. For days, the runner might speak to no one, locked in the rhythm of his own breathing and the thud squelch of his feet. He carries a letter sealed with green wax and stamped with a signet ring. He likely cannot read it. He is a bearer of secrets he cannot understand. The parchment in his pouch might contain a declaration of war, a warrant for an execution, or a love letter that will shatter a dynasty. He is the ignorant vessel of history. There is a profound irony in his exhaustion. He is burning his body's energy to deliver news that might result in the burning of a city. Yet he remains outside the politics, concerned only with the next mile. He is the needle threading the disparate patches of the kingdom together. Scholars debate the speed of these runners, but records suggest they were astonishingly fast. A professional courier could cover 30 to 40 miles a day, every day, regardless of weather. In extreme cases, covering urgent news, they could outpace a horseman over long distances because the runner did not need to stop to graze a beast or have it reshod. They were the ultramarathoners of their day, their bodies lean, sinewy, and aged prematurely by the sun and the wind. But they paid a price. Chronic joint pain, stress fractures, and runner's face, gaunt and weathered, were the badges of their trade. They slept in ditches or under hedges when inns were too expensive or too full, curling up in their cloaks, vulnerable to the cold and to thieves who might cut their throats just for their boots. The filthy truth of the road is also literal. The messenger is traveling through a landscape that is not sanitized. He passes gibbets where the bodies of criminals hang in iron cages, rotting as a warning to travelers, a grim roadside billboard. He wades through streams that serve as sewers for upstream tanneries. He is exposed to the elements in a way modern people can scarcely imagine. If it rains, he is wet for days. If it snows, he keeps moving to avoid freezing to death. There is no waterproof Gore-Tex, only lanolin-soaked wool that smells of wet sheep and weighs heavy on his shoulders. As the sun begins to dip low, casting long, bruised shadows across the path, the landscape begins to change. The trees thin out. The muddy track widens and becomes joined by other paths, like tributaries feeding a river. The silence of the countryside is replaced by a faint, low hum, a vibration in the air. The smell changes too. The crisp scent of wet leaves and earth is overtaken by a heavier, more complex odor. A mix of wood smoke, roasting meat, human waste, and unwashed multitudes. The runner crests a hill and stops, leaning on his staff, his chest heaving. Below him, sprawling within a girdle of stone walls, lies the destination, the city. It is a hive of humanity, a dense tangle of timber and thatch rising from the mud. The gates are still open, but the guards are preparing to close them for the night. The runner forces his tired legs into one last effort. He is leaving the horizontal misery of the road for the vertical misery of the town. He passes through the gate, showing his badge of office, and is instantly swallowed by the noise. The city is a different organism entirely, crowded, vertical, loud, and intensely dirty. He navigates the twisting, narrow streets, dodging carts and pigs, heading for the merchant's house or the urban palace where he will deliver his burden. His journey is done. But for the servants who live here, trapped within these walls, life is a different kind of endurance test. We follow him not to the great house, but look upward, past the shops and the signboards, to the teetering upper stories of the city dwellings. There, in the cramped, smoky crawl spaces beneath the eaves, a different class of servant wakes to a different kind of darkness. The runner has the open sky. The urban servant has the attic. The messenger vanishes into the chaotic tapestry of the street, a single thread lost in a weave of wool and shouting, but our gaze does not follow him. Instead, we drift upward, ascending the timber-framed face of a merchant's tall, narrow house. We rise past the bustling shop front on the ground floor, where apprentices are selling cloth or spices, past the solar on the first floor, where the master and his family dine in relative comfort. And finally, we squeeze ourselves into the very apex of the building, the garret. This is the attic, the architectural afterthought of the medieval city. And this is where you live. If the castle servant battles the cold, the urban servant battles the smoke. In a city like London, Paris, or York, space is money, and houses grow vertically to avoid the taxes on ground width. You are trapped in the eaves, a triangular crawl space where the roof beams meet, creating a claustrophobic geometry that forces you to stoop constantly. There is no chimney here, perhaps only a small shuttered opening that lets in more draft than light. The heat from the entire house rises, carrying with it the smoke from the kitchen fires below, the steam from the laundry, and the odors of the family's life. It collects here, in your sleeping quarters, forming a permanent blue-gray haze that stings your eyes and coats your lungs with soot. You are the filter for the house. The city outside is a beast that never truly sleeps, and neither do you. The walls here are thin, wattle and daub, a mixture of woven wood and mud, and they vibrate with the sounds of the metropolis. You hear the iron-rimmed wheels of carts rattling over cobblestones at 4 a.m., the shouting of the night watch, the ringing of church bells marking the canonical hours, and the drunken arguments spilling out of the alehouse down the lane. Privacy is a concept that simply does not apply to you. You likely share this small, stifling triangle with 2 or 3 other servants, apprentices, maids, or shop boys. You sleep on a shared pallet, fighting for blanket space, breathing each other's air. The intimacy is forced and sweaty. In the summer, the garret becomes an oven, baking under the sun-heated tiles or thatch. In the winter, it is an icebox where the condensation from your breath freezes on the rafters. Your morning ritual begins not with a rooster, but with the city bell. Your first task involves descending the treacherous steep ladder stairs, often little more than a notched log in the semi-darkness. Gravity is your enemy here. A slip means a broken ankle and immediate dismissal. You reach the ground floor and step out into the street, and immediately your senses are assaulted. The medieval city is an olfactory map. You can tell where you are with your eyes closed. The metallic tang of the smithy, the yeast and warm grain of the brewery, the acrid, urine-soaked stench of the tannery, and the cloying sweetness of the rotting fruit in the market. But the dominant feature of the street is the kennel, the open gutter running down the center of the road. This is the city's intestine. It carries rainwater, yes, but also the washwater from houses, the blood from the butcher's block, and the contents of chamber pots emptied from windows above. The cry of Gardilou, a corruption of the French Gardalou, watch out for the water, is the urban servant's warning siren. You learn to walk close to the walls, under the overhanging jetties of the upper floors, to avoid the rain that isn't rain. One of your primary duties is the daily pilgrimage to the conduit. Unlike the castle with its private well, the city house often relies on public water sources. You grab your wooden buckets or earthenware jugs and head to the neighborhood fountain or pump. This is the social hub of the servant class. Here, in the queue, waiting for the slow trickle of lead-piped water, the news of the city is exchanged. You hear which merchant is bankrupt, which apprentice ran away, and which baker was put in the pillory for selling underweight loaves. It is the medieval internet, a network of gossip powered by boredom and waiting. But the water is heavy and the streets are slick. Navigating the crowd with full buckets requires the grace of a dancer and the aggression of a soldier. You are constantly bumped, shoved, and harangued by street hawkers selling hot pies, ribbons, or prayers. Fire is the terror that lives in the back of every urban servant's mind. The city is a tinderbox. Timber houses, thatched roofs, straw floors, and open fires everywhere. A spark in a baker's shop can turn a neighborhood into ash in an hour. As a servant, you are the fire warden. You are responsible for covering the fire at curfew, literally couvre-feu, banking the embers with ash so they don't flare up in the night. If a fire starts in your house, the law is brutal. The householder can be fined or imprisoned, but you, the servant whose negligence caused it, might face severe corporal punishment. You live in a state of hypervigilance, sniffing the air for the scent of burning thatch. Many cities had laws requiring a bucket of water to be kept by the door at all times, a primitive fire extinguisher that you must keep filled. There is a scholarly debate about the quality of life for the urban servant versus the castle servant. Some historians argue that the city offered more freedom, a chance to learn a trade, to make contacts, to perhaps one day open a shop of your own. The phrase, town air makes you free, Stadtluft macht frei, referred to the law that a feudal serf who managed to live in a city for a year and a day was released from his bond to the land. But for you, the freedom feels theoretical. The reality is the endless stairs, the heavy buckets, and the constant navigation of filth. You are also the primary shopper. You go to the shambles, the meat market, to buy the cheaper cuts, animal feet, ears, or tripe, haggling with sharp-tongued butchers who spot a novice a mile away. You carry the food home in a basket, protecting it from the kites and ravens, scavenger birds protected by law in London because they ate the garbage in the streets. They are your competitors for the city's refuse. Cleanliness in the city is a battle against probability. You sweep the shop front, pushing the dust into the kennel, but the next cart that rattles by splashes mud right back onto your threshold. It is a Sisyphean task. You might visit the public bathhouse, the stews, but these places have a reputation for more than just bathing, often serving as brothels. For a respectable servant, hygiene is a basin of cold water in the scullery and a rigorous checking of clothes for fleas, which thrive in the crowded urban fabric. As the day turns to dusk, the city undergoes a transformation. The shutters are closed, the stalls are packed away, and the streets become the domain of the night watch and the rakers, men paid to scrape the worst of the muck from the thoroughfares. You retreat back up the stairs, your legs aching from the climb. You carry a tallow candle, guarding the flame with your hand, creating a small sphere of light in the gloom. The family eats downstairs, and you serve them, standing in the shadows of the solar. This is the final performance of the day. You are tired, you smell of the street, but you must present a clean face and a steady hand. You watch them eat the food you bought, drinking the wine you fetched. This is the invisible wall within the house, the few feet of space between the table and the wall where you stand. It is a social chasm that is almost impossible to cross. But as you stand there, hungry and waiting for the signal to clear the trenches, you observe the ritual of the meal. It is a theater of power, and you are the stagehand. The noise of the city fades to a dull roar outside, but inside, the silence of service takes over. The master raises his cup. You step forward to fill it. The light from the hearth catches the silver, blinding you for a moment. You are not a person here. You are a function. And nowhere is this function more ritualized, more demanding, and more physically exhausting than in the service of the high table, where the act of dining becomes a weapon of status. The candle flickers in the drafty urban garret, but our vision expands now, moving from the intimate poverty of the city attic back to the grand stage where the drama of medieval service reaches its most theatrical peak, the high table. We step into the great hall at the height of a feast, a sensory explosion of noise, heat, and color that assaults the senses. To the Lord and his guests, this is a celebration of power and plenty. To you, the servant standing in the shadows, it is a test of physical endurance that rivals the labor of the field or the forge. You are no longer a scullion scrubbing pots or a stable boy in the straw. You are now part of the visible machinery of the household, a sewer or server, a term derived from the old French asseoir, meaning to seat or to place, which has tragically shifted in modern English to mean a waste pipe. In the Middle Ages, however, the sewer was a figure of dignity, often a young squire learning the arts of service before becoming a knight. But for the lower-ranking attendants who support him, the experience is one of rigid, agonizing discipline. You stand with your back against the stone wall, or hover just outside the circle of torchlight, rendered invisible by your station. The air is thick with the smoke of roasting meat, the sweet, cloying scent of beeswax, and the heavy perfume of the diners, masking the underlying odors of the rush-covered floor we know so well. Your eyes are fixed on the high table, a dais raised above the rest of the room where the master and his most honored guests sit. They are dining on messes, sharing platters of food in groups of 2 or 4, a communal intimacy that requires strict etiquette. But you are not eating. You are starving. The smell of roasted peacock, reassembled with its iridescent feathers as a centerpiece, or the savory steam rising from a coffin, a thick pastry crust filled with stewed venison, drifts toward you, triggering a painful biological cramping in your empty stomach. This is the torture of the hall, to be surrounded by the greatest abundance your world can offer, yet forbidden to taste a crumb. You must stand perfectly still, your hands often behind your back or holding a towel, locking your knees to keep from fainting in the stifling heat. The weight of the silence you must maintain is as heavy as the silver platters you will soon carry. The ritual of the meal is a minefield of potential failure. We watch the pantler, the officer in charge of the bread, the pane, as he approaches the Lord. He carries the salt cellar, often a massive, ornate, ship-shaped vessel called a nef, which marks the master's status. Sitting above the salt is a place of honor. Below the salt, a place for the unworthy. But before a single morsel touches the noble lip, a dark pantomime must be performed, the assay. In a world where political rivals might slip arsenic or hemlock into a stew, trust is non-existent. The servant must become the biological shield. You watch as the pantler takes a piece of bread, dips it into the salt, and eats it in front of the Lord. The cupbearer pours a small amount of wine into the cover of the goblet and drinks it himself. Only when these servants do not gasp, choke, or turn blue does the meal proceed. It is a grim reminder that your life is valued precisely as a filtration system for the master's safety. You are the canary in the coal mine of the banquet. There is a scholarly debate about how often poisonings actually occurred versus how much was paranoia. But for the servant performing the assay, the fear is real every single time. You swallow the wine, waiting for the burn that isn't alcohol. When it doesn't come, you bow and recede into the background, a ghost who has survived another course. The physical labor of serving is underestimated. The platters are not lightweight china. They are solid silver, pewter, or trenchers made of stale, heavy bread, piled high with meats and sauces. Carrying a loaded charger from the distant kitchen, which was often built separately to prevent fire, to the high table is a journey of 50 or 100 yards, repeated dozens of times. The food must be hot, but the distance fights you. In winter, the gravy congeals before you reach the dais. In summer, the sweat runs down your back, itching maddeningly under your wool tunic, but you cannot scratch. You present the dish on your left knee, a posture of submission that strains the joints. If you spill, the humiliation is public and the punishment swift. The carver, a high-ranking servant, wields a knife with the precision of a surgeon, slicing the meat in the air or on the platter, never touching it with his fingers. His hands are manicured, his towel spotless. But look closer at his face. The tension is evident in the set of his jaw. He is performing a high wire act with a blade under the scrutiny of 100 eyes. Then there are the sautelts, subtleties, elaborate sugar sculptures, or marzipan figures brought out between courses to entertain the guests. These might depict castles, ships, or scenes from mythology. They are heavy, fragile, and sticky. You must carry these masterpieces through a crowded, drunken hall without tripping over a dog or a sprawling diner. The hall is not a library. It is a riot. As the wine flows, the noise level rises. Knights pound the tables, minstrels play bagpipes, and jesters tumble through the rushes. You are the calm center of this chaos, the invisible rail upon which the service glides. You learn to anticipate the needs of the diners before they speak. A lifted eyebrow means more wine. A slight turn of the head means the bread is gone. You are a mind reader in a tunic, but there is a filthy truth hiding in the sharing of the cup. The communal goblet passes from lip to lip. The lord, the lady, the guest, the stranger. We see the grease from their mouths rimming the metal. We see the coughing knight taking a swig and passing it on. In an age before germ theory, this table is a vector for disaster. You, the servant, are constantly handling these cups, wiping them with a cloth that hangs from your belt. A cloth that becomes increasingly damp and bacterial as the night wears on. You are the unseen carrier of the microscopic world. As the feast winds down, the void is called, a final course of spiced wine, hippocras, and wafers to settle the stomach, followed by the clearing of the table. The almoner collects the leftover bread and meat in a large alms dish. Theoretically, this is destined for the poor at the castle gate, a charitable act to buy the Lord's way into heaven. In reality, the broken meats are often picked over by the servants first. This is your dinner, the cold, mangled remains of the feast, eaten standing up in the corridor or huddled in the kitchen. You gnaw on a bone a duke has already sucked. You eat the crust of a pie that was touched by a bishop's unwashed hand. It is a trickle-down diet, sustaining you, but linking your biology intimately with theirs. The fatigue that sets in now is bone deep. Your feet are swollen, your back spasms from hours of standing rigid. The torches burn low, filling the upper air with acrid smoke that settles in your throat. The guests stumble off to their chambers, assisted by body servants, who will undress them. You remain to clear the wreckage. The floor is a battlefield of bones, crusts, and spilled wine. The dogs are fighting over the scraps. You move through the debris, a silent cleaner in the aftermath of gluttony. But amidst the exhaustion, there is a heat rising in your body that is not from the fire, a flush on your cheek that is not from the wine you didn't drink. The crowded hall, the shared cups, the fleas in the rushes, and the constant proximity to travelers from plague-ridden cities have created the perfect storm. The feast is over, but something has been left behind in the air, something that does not respect rank or station. You feel a shiver that has nothing to do with the winter draft. You rub your forehead, and it is hot and dry. The narrative of the servant's life is about to shift from labor to survival. We leave the fading light of the great hall and descend into the cramped, dark reality of the servants' quarters, where the true cost of this communal living is about to be paid. The fever has arrived. The heat that began as a flush on your cheek in the great hall has now become a raging fire consuming your entire body. And the narrative shifts from the public spectacle of the feast to the private, terrifying claustrophobia of the sickbed. You have collapsed onto your pallet in the servants' quarters, a long, low room in the basement or an attic space crowded with sleeping bodies packed as tight as salted herring. The air here is heavy, stagnant, and sour, recycled through the lungs of 20 other people before it reaches you. In the dark, the sound of the room is a chorus of exhaustion, the grinding of teeth, the muttering of dreams, and the wet, rattling coughs that never seem to stop. You are shivering violently, your teeth chattering with a sound that seems deafening in the gloom, yet you are burning up. This is the ague, the burning sickness, or perhaps the early stages of the bloody flux, terms that cover 1,000 different modern diagnoses, from influenza to typhus. In the medieval world, specific diagnosis is a luxury for the rich. For the servant, sickness is simply a binary state. Can you work, or are you dying? The terrifying reality of medieval service is that there is no concept of sick leave. There are no paid days off, no human resources department to process a medical claim. Your value is entirely bound to your physical utility. A broken loom can be fixed. A broken servant is often discarded. This creates a culture of desperate concealment. You bite your lip to stop from groaning, curling into a tight ball under your thin, scratchy woolen blanket. You know that if the steward or the housekeeper hears you, the calculation will be swift and brutal. If it is a minor ailment, you might be beaten for laziness. If it appears contagious, you are a liability to the entire household. The fear of contagion in the Middle Ages was profound, rooted in the theory of miasma, the belief that disease was carried in foul smells and corrupt air. A sick servant is a source of pollution. You have seen others put out, literally dragged to the castle gates and left on the roadside, or carted to a spittle house, hospital, run by monks, which, despite the charitable intent, was often little more than a waiting room for the grave. So you lie in the dark and pray to Saint Roche or Saint Sebastian, the patron saints of plague and pestilence, begging for the fever to break before the dawn bell rings. You are thirsty, a thirst so deep it feels like your throat is lined with sand, but the water bucket is across the room and you are too weak to stand. Here, in the shadows, a small, invisible history plays out, the history of quiet solidarity. The servant sleeping next to you, a scullery maid who smells of onions and lye, hears your distress. She does not call the supervisor. Instead, she reaches out a rough hand to touch your burning forehead. She shifts her own blanket to cover you. She might have a small stash of dried herbs, feverfew or betony, sewn into the hem of her dress, a peasant remedy passed down from her grandmother. She chews the bitter leaves and presses them to your lips, or wets a rag from her own small cup of water to dab your face. This is the only health care you will receive, the unauthorized, whisper-quiet care of your peers, while the lord of the manor might summon a university-trained physician who consults star charts and examines a flask of urine held up to the light to balance the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. You are left to the mercy of the body's own defenses. Historical records show that noble households spent vast fortunes on theriac, a complex medical concoction containing snake flesh and opium, and crushed gemstones for the master's ailments. For the servant, the cure was often a good bleeding by the local barber surgeon, if you could afford his penny fee, or simply endurance. The filthy truth here is that the crowded conditions of servant life made them petri dishes for infection. Jail fever, typhus, spread by the lice that infested the bedding, swept through servants' quarters with devastating speed. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, thrived in the damp, smoky air of the kitchens and guardrooms. You are fighting a war on a microscopic battlefield you cannot see, armed only with superstition and a strong heart. The fever brings hallucinations. The shadows on the ceiling turn into the gargoyles from the cathedral. The snoring of the groom next to you becomes the growl of a bear. You drift in and out of consciousness, sweating into the straw mattress. This mattress is its own hazard. Straw that is not changed frequently rots from the bottom up, becoming a breeding ground for moles and vermin. You are lying on a compost heap that is slowly heating up from decomposition, adding its own sickly warmth to your fever. It is a grim irony that the very bed you rest in might be poisoning you. But let us suppose you are lucky. Let us suppose your constitution, hardened by years of hauling water and eating coarse bread, fights back. The fever breaks. You wake up 2 days later, weak as a kitten, your tunic soaked in cold sweat, the room swimming before your eyes. The sun is up. The bell is ringing. The terror returns instantly. You have missed work. You struggle to your feet, the world tilting on its axis. You must present yourself. You must look useful. You splash cold water on your face, pinching your cheeks to bring back color, hiding the tremor in your hands. You walk into the kitchen or the stable, terrifyingly frail, hoping to slip back into the rhythm before you are noticed. Sometimes, the master is benevolent. A loyal servant who has worked for the family for years might be granted korodi, a form of pension or allowance of food and shelter within a monastery, or simply allowed to rest in a corner of the kitchen. But for the lower servants, the scullions and the runners, there is no such safety net. You work or you starve. You pick up the heavy iron pot, your muscles screaming, your head pounding, and you lift. You lift because the alternative is the road, and the road is death. This is the brutality of the medieval economy. It consumed bodies. It used them up like tallow candles, burning them at both ends until there was nothing left but a smudge of smoke. Survivorship bias colors our view of history. We see the suits of armor in museums and imagine strong, healthy men. We do not see the skeletons of the servants, which often tell a different story. Vertebrae fused from heavy lifting, shins scarred from infection, teeth worn down by grit in the bread, and growth plates arrested by malnutrition. You, the survivor of the fever, are now one of the seasoned ones. You have antibodies, you have toughness. But the illness has taken a toll. It has aged you. In the Middle Ages, age was not just a number. It was a physical condition. A servant of 40 might be considered old, their body worn out by a lifetime of friction against the stone and the soil. As you resume your duties, moving a little slower, lifting a little less, you begin to notice the others who are disappearing. The old porter who could no longer carry the trunks, gone. The laundress whose hands became too crippled to wring the sheets, gone. Where do they go? They fade into the background, into the charitable shadows of the almshouse, if they are lucky, or into the stark visibility of the beggar's life, if they are not. The fever was a sudden crisis, a sharp, violent test. But now, as the adrenaline of survival fades, you face the slower, quieter, and ultimately more inevitable tragedy of the servant's life. The obsolescence of the flesh. The body is the only capital you own, and day by day, hour by hour, it is depreciating. We move now to the twilight of the servant's career to see what happens when the hands that built the medieval world can no longer hold the tools. The fire has burned down to embers, and the cold is creeping back in. The fever has passed, and the seasons have turned, wheeling through years of planting and harvest, feast and famine, until a new and quieter winter settles into your bones, one that will not lift with the coming of spring. We have reached the twilight of the servant's life, a time when the body, which has been your only currency, your only shield, and your only home, finally declares bankruptcy. You wake in the grey pre-dawn light, just as you have for 40 years, but the fluid motion of rising is gone. In its place is a rigid, grinding resistance. Your joints, worn down by decades of hauling water, scrubbing stone, and sleeping on damp earth, have calcified into a cage of pain. The medieval physician might call it cold humors or rheumatism. You simply know it as the slowing down. You look at your hands, the hands that have plucked 10,000 geese, polished acres of silver, or turned the heavy spit until the skin blistered. They are gnarled now, the fingers permanently curved into the shape of the tools they once held, the knuckles swollen and angry. They are the hands of a veteran who fought a war against dirt and gravity and lost. The tragedy of the aging servant is not just the pain, it is the obsolescence. In a world that runs on muscle power, frailty is a fireable offense. You watch the new generation entering the household. Boys with straight backs and boundless energy. Girls with smooth, unscarred hands. They move with a speed you can no longer match. You see the impatience in the steward's eyes when you pause to catch your breath on the stairs. You feel the silence that falls when you drop a plate because your grip has failed. It is the terrifying realization that you are becoming useless mouths, a medieval economic term for those who consume food but produce no labor. The fear of dismissal is a cold stone in your gut. To be turned out now without family or land is a death sentence. There is no pension plan, no social security. There is only the charity of the master or the mercy of the road. However, for the lucky few, the faithful retainers who have served a noble family for a lifetime, there is a different path, though it is one of quiet erasure. You might be granted a korodi. This was a form of medieval retirement, often purchased by the lord from a local monastery. It grants you a room, a daily loaf of bread, and a gallon of ale for the rest of your days. It sounds idyllic, but it is a life of enforced silence and waiting. You are moved from the bustling heart of the castle, with its noise and heat and gossip, to the cold, contemplative silence of the cloister. You become a pensioner of God, sitting on a stone bench in the sun, watching the bees in the herb garden, your working life severed as clean as a cut cord. You are safe, but you are alone with your memories. For others, the end is less formal. You simply slide down the hierarchy. The cook who once commanded the kitchen becomes the potato peeler in the corner. The nurse who suckled the king becomes the old woman who mends the linen by the fire, her eyes failing in the dim light. You become a fixture of the household, tolerated rather than employed. You are the old Nan or old Tom, a figure of folklore to the children, telling stories of the old lord's battles or the great famine of years past. You find utility in the small things, watching the pot so it doesn't boil over, soothing a crying child, keeping the dogs quiet. It is a reduced existence, a shrinking of your world to the radius of the hearth. But there is a filthy truth, even in this gentle decline. The elderly servant is often the keeper of the household's darkest secrets. You know which child is illegitimate. You know where the silver was hidden during the siege. You know why the lady cries at night. This knowledge is your final protection. You are kept warm and fed, not just out of gratitude, but out of a subtle fear of what you might say if you were cast out. You are a living archive of the family's history, a leather-bound book that no one wants to read, but no one dares to throw away. Physically, the years of poor nutrition and hard labor manifest in specific, brutal ways. Your teeth, worn down by the grit in stone-ground bread, are painful stubs or gone entirely, forcing you to eat sops, bread soaked in broth, a return to the diet of the infant. Your eyesight, clouded by cataracts from years of smoke and strain, turns the world into a blur of shadows. You navigate the castle by touch and smell, your feet knowing the hollow of every step, your nose telling you when the bread is done. You are becoming a ghost before you have even died, haunting the corridors you used to scrub. One evening, you sit by the fire in the kitchen, the heat soaking into your aching knees. The noise of the dinner service rages around you, the shouting, the clattering, the panic, but you're outside of it now. You watch a young scullion struggling with a heavy cauldron, the same struggle you faced 50 years ago. You see the fear in his eyes, the sweat on his brow. For a moment, you want to get up to help him, to show him the trick of leverage that makes the weight bearable. But your legs will not obey. You can only watch. The cycle is continuing without you. The castle is a machine that replaces its parts. The stone remains, the fire remains, the hunger remains. Only the faces change. There is a profound melancholy in this moment, but also a strange peace. You have survived. You survived the plague that took half the village. You survived the winter that froze the birds in the trees. You survived the beatings, the burns, and the exhaustion. You are a testament to the resilience of the human animal. You close your tired eyes, listening to the roar of the fire. It sounds like a distant ocean. You think of the fields where you played as a child, green and open, before the walls closed in. You think of the faces of friends long gone. The fatigue is different now. It is not the sharp exhaustion of a day's work, but the heavy velvet curtain of a life's end. You are ready to lay the burden down. You are ready to stop lifting. The history books will not record your name. There will be no statue in the square. But you were the hands. You were the feet. You were the back upon which the entire age rested. And now, the earth is waiting to take back the strength it lent you. The fire in the hearth has finally burned down to white ash, and the warmth that sustained you through the long winter of your final years has quietly withdrawn. The end of the servant's life is rarely marked by the fanfare of the trumpet or the weeping of a nation. It comes as a cessation of effort, a final laying down of the burden. You have breathed your last in the corner of the kitchen, or perhaps on a pallet in the almshouse, and now you are prepared for the only journey you will ever take that does not involve an errand. There is a profound gentleness in this final chapter. For the first time in your life, you are the one being served. Hands that are not your own, perhaps the hands of the scullery maid who once brought you water, or the old porter who shared your bench, wash your body. It is a humble, silent ritual. They wash away the soot of the kitchen, the dust of the stable, and the grime of the city. They straighten the limbs that were twisted by labor. For a brief moment, stripped of the tunic and the apron, you are not a servant. You are simply human. Your body a map of the history it survived. There is likely no coffin for you. Wood is expensive, a resource for furniture and fires, not for burying the poor. Instead, you are wrapped in a shroud, a simple sheet of linen, perhaps an old tablecloth, or a sheet that was darned too many times to be used by the master. It is stitched or tied at the head and feet. In some parishes, there is a communal coffin, a sturdy wooden box used to carry the body from the church to the grave, but it does not go into the ground with you. At the graveside, the bottom is unlatched, and the body slips out into the earth, allowing the coffin to be hoisted back up for the next soul. It is a harsh efficiency, but one you would understand. You lived a life of borrowing the master's tools, borrowing the master's heat, and now you borrow the vehicle of your departure. The grave itself is unmarked. There is no money for a stonemason, no inscription to record your name or your years of service. You are lowered into the churchyard, into a patch of ground already thick with the bones of those who came before you. The soil of the medieval city is a crowded place. Because space was limited, graves were often reused after a generation or two. The bones of the long dead were dug up and moved to the charnel house, or ossuary, to make room for the newly dead. In this way, the servant class is quite literally mixed together, a collective ancestry of labor returning to the mud. The distinction between the groom, the cook, and the laundress dissolves. You become part of the geological layer of the parish. Archaeologists excavating these medieval pauper graves find a different kind of history than the one written in books. They do not find gold rings or swords. They find Schmoll's nodes on the vertebrae, indentations caused by the immense pressure of carrying heavy loads. They find enamel hyperplasia on the teeth, horizontal lines that mark periods of starvation or severe fever in childhood. They find femurs thick with muscle attachment sites, evidence of a life of constant walking. Your biography is written in your calcium. It is the only record that cannot lie. It tells the truth of the filthy life, that it was hard, that it hurt, but that it was endured. Yet there is a peacefulness to this anonymity. The king lies in his cathedral tomb, his effigy frozen in stone, his legacy subject to the judgment of historians, his deeds scrutinized and criticized for centuries. The servant simply sleeps. You have slipped beneath the surface of the story. The grass grows over the mound, fed by the richness of the organic life returning to the soil. The sheep may graze there, the children may play there. You have become the foundation. And this is the ultimate truth of the medieval world. It stands on your shoulders. The great cathedral where the bishop prays, you mix the mortar, you haul the stone. The tapestry that hangs in the hall, you sheared the sheep, you spun the wool. The food that fueled the philosopher's thoughts, you planted the seed, you turned the spit. The history of the Middle Ages is usually told as a history of heads, kings, popes, generals. But it was a history of hands. Without the filthy work of the servant, the clean work of civilization would have been impossible. The beauty of the illuminated manuscript exists only because someone made the parchment from dirty skins. The romance of the courtly love song exists only because someone emptied the chamber pots so the air would be sweet enough to sing in. As we stand over this fresh patch of earth, The sun begins to set, casting long golden shadows across the churchyard. The bells ring out for vespers, a sound you knew well, a sound that organized your days. But now, you do not have to move. You do not have to light the fire. You do not have to fetch the water. The wheel has stopped turning. The earth is cool and heavy, a blanket that will never need washing. The filthy truth is that there was dignity in the dirt. There was a profound, quiet heroism in the ability to wake up every morning in the cold and keep the world running. You were the grease in the axle of history. The camera of our narrative pulls back now, rising high above the churchyard, above the thatched roofs of the village, above the stone towers of the castle. We see the smoke rising from the chimneys, the sign that life goes on. We see the new generation of servants moving through the courtyards, carrying the buckets, turning the spits. They do not know your name, but they walk in your footsteps. The world is vast, and time is a river that washes everything away eventually. But for a moment, we have looked into the shadows. We have seen the faces behind the feast. We have acknowledged the cost of the comfort. The darkness of the night is complete now. The stars wheel overhead, indifferent and beautiful. The noise of the medieval world, the shouting, the hammering, the carts on the cobblestones, fades into a gentle hum. The struggle is over. The hunger is gone. There is only the earth, and the silence, and the long, dreamless sleep of the just. You have earned your rest. The dirt that coated your skin is now the earth that cradles your bones. And in that embrace, there is no high or low, no master or servant. There is only peace. The fire has gone out. The castle is asleep. And the long centuries have rolled over the graves of those we visited tonight. We have walked through the mud, breathed the smoke, and carried the heavy buckets of history. But now it is time to set the burden down. You can let go of the weight now. The kitchen is closed, the stable is quiet, and the work is done. There is nothing left for you to do but drift. Let the images of the past dissolve into the soft, velvet darkness of your own room. The voices of the servants are just a whisper in the wind, protecting you, watching over the night. You are safe. You are warm. You are clean. Let your breathing slow down to the rhythm of the earth itself. Deep, slow, and steady. History is a story we tell to understand the light, but sleep is the shadow where we find our rest. Close your eyes. Let the centuries fade. Sweet dreams.